The sour warmth of Arag. Milk on the Mongolian steppe. You lie still now, wrapped in blankets or curled beneath a familiar sheet, and I invite you to wander far, far back, far east into a land not drawn by borders, but by hoofbeats and wind. The Mongolian steppe stretches ahead of you, golden and immense, a place where the grass does not stop and the eye learns to rest on the horizon alone. Dot in the silence. There is movement. Slow, rhythmic. The sloshing of milk in the leather sack. We begin not with war nor conquest. Not yet, but with something quieter. A skin bag, bulging at its seams. It hangs in the shadow of a ger, what you might call a yurt. Its round walls are packed with felt and dung smoke. Inside, a woman rocks the bag gently with her foot as she sews. Milk must not sit still. This milk, you see, is not cow's milk. It is Mare's milk. And what it will become Arag is perhaps the oldest drink you've never tasted. Mare's milk is thinner than cow's. It has more lactose, less fat. If you drink it fresh, it is sweet and almost watery. But that is not the point. The Mongols, even in the 13th century, had no desire to drink it fresh. They were waiting for the sour, for the bubbling, for the bacteria to speak. Fermentation on the steppe was not a scientific process. It was, in every sense, alive. The process was passed down not by measurement, but by rhythm and taste and muscle memory. The leather bag called a kukul was never washed, not entirely. Bacteria from previous batches lived in its seams, clung to its fibers. In that way, every generation of milk was a descendant of the last. The milk would be added slowly, ladled and warm. It must be fresh, ideally just after milking. The bag was shaken or stirred many times a day. Children did it. Elders did it. It became part of the daily flow, as habitual as breathing or tending fire. After 2 to 3 days, a change would come. You would open the skin sack and breathe in. The scent was not pleasant in the way modern things are. It was sharp, tangy, full. It smelled of horses and grass and patience. The taste, too, was strange. To a modern tongue, Arag is offensive, sour, fizzy, almost alcoholic, but barely. Imagine yogurt left out in the sun, or sour cream mixed with champagne. But here, in the wind-carved silence of Mongolia, it was prized. It refreshed. It nourished. And in truth, there was little else. The Mongol diet of the 1200s was not a varied thing. It revolved around animals, what they gave in life and in death. Meat, milk, blood, fat. Even the bones were boiled for soup. But fresh vegetables were rare. Bread almost unheard of, and salt a luxury. Arag, then, was more than drink. It was nutrition, hydration, and celebration. Historians often forget these quiet miracles. They rush toward the clamor of horses charging through Europe, toward blood and empire and the Pax Mongolica. But under that armor, beneath the banners, were men and women who swayed felt bags of sour milk, waiting for the right tang. Even the Khans, yes, even Genghis drank Arag. In fact, it was central to his authority. To offer Arag to a guest was sacred. Refusing it was an insult. Accepting it meant recognizing the host's hospitality and power. To drink it from a shared bowl was to partake in something older than any law. Imagine, then, a diplomat from the Song dynasty, perhaps a stiff man from the southern courts of China. He steps into a Mongol ger, blinking against the smoke, the heat, the sudden closeness of wool and horsehide. A bowl is pressed into his hand. Inside, a cloudy, bubbling liquid. It smells like sweat and vinegar. To refuse is unthinkable. So he drinks in this simple moment, a sip of fermented Mare's milk. Entire empires were built or dissolved. We have records from Persian travelers, Arab chroniclers, even Russian monks who found themselves in the orbits of Mongol hosts. They all described this drink, often in horror. But they also noted its place in ceremony, in politics, in daily survival. It was more than a beverage. It was the blood of the steppes. The process of milking a Mare was also no simple thing. Unlike cows, Mares produce milk in small amounts, and only when they trust the milker. The foal must be nearby. Sometimes it must begin to suckle, and then be pulled away gently so the milk can be taken. A delicate, almost intimate process, repeated several times a day. Now, listen. Do you hear the soft slap of milk against leather? The creak of the wooden frame of the gare? A baby stirs. Outside, a wind stirs the dry grass. The world is unchanged for hours at a time. But the milk ferments. You might ask, why is this important? Why talk about this? Because history is not just shaped by swords and decrees. It is shaped by what people ate, how they drank, how they stayed alive. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in world history, was fueled not just by strategy or bloodlust. It was sustained by sour milk in swinging sacks. Even Marco Polo, in his long, embellished travels, noted how the Mongols drank white liquor. He described their constant movement, the endless grazing, the need to preserve energy and resources. A people on horseback cannot stop to cook grain, but they can drink arag day after day and remain nourished. And then there was kumis, the Turkic word for the same drink. It traveled west with the steppe peoples. Even today, in parts of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, you can buy it. Cold, sharp, bottled. A ghost of the past, sipped through plastic straws. But the taste still resists modernity. You imagine taking a sip now. It fizzes on your tongue. Your stomach tightens. But somehow, you feel awake. You feel full. As though the wind itself had entered your blood. And so I ask you, gently, as the sky over the steppe begins to pale with dawn. Ifarag was the lifeblood of empire. What else have we forgotten that once sustained the world? When you imagine a Mongol encampment in the vast open steppe wind brushing against woolen tents and horses, grazing freely under an endless sky, it is easy to be swept up in the romance of the nomadic life. But the daily work of survival in this harsh, beautiful land was anything but romantic, especially when it came to the curious process of producing one of the Mongol world's most essential foods, arag, the fermented Mare's milk that defined their cuisine, their culture, and, in many ways, their resilience. In the last section, we explored what Mare's milk tasted like, its tangy sharpness, its thin, watery texture, and how unfamiliar it might seem to modern palates. But today, we descend deeper, moving past taste into process and people, and the slow, steady rituals that brought arag into being, not in royal courts or battlefields, but in ordinary felt tents with wooden churns and patient hands. The Mares. Schedule. Timing the milk to produce arag, one needed Mares. But not just any Mares ones that had recently foaled. Mongol herders, mostly women, closely tracked the breeding and foaling schedule of each horse, because a Mare only gave milk for 4 to 5 months after giving birth. This window defined the arag season. Spring brought foaling, and with it, the promise of milk. In early summer, as grass turned lush and the foals grew sturdy, the milking began in earnest. Mongol women would tether a Mare gently and encourage her to release milk by allowing her foal to suckle first, then pulling the foal away and quickly milking the now lactating Mare by hand. This process was repeated several times a day. The Mongols, moving frequently to keep their herds fed, had to balance mobility with routine. The act of milking kneeling on cold earth, coaxing a stream from a temperamental Mare, keeping watch for wolves or storms, was both intimate and exhausting. It was a rhythm that required endurance, gentleness, and timing. Each drop of milk mattered. It was not simply a food, but a form of stored energy, a seasonal bounty converted into a product that, while perishable, could nourish an entire people. On the move, the leather churn. Fermentation by motion raw Mare's milk alone was not Arag. The transformation into the fizzy, fermented drink required a tool, a technique, and time. The tool was the kukur, a large leather sack made from horsehide or cowhide, often hung from the central beam of a ger, the Mongol tent. Fresh milk would be poured into the kukur multiple times per day. Then came the crucial part, the churning. Mongols would strike or shake the kukur hundreds of times daily. This wasn't just tradition, it was science through motion. The shaking introduced air, helped encourage fermentation, and evenly distributed the microbes necessary for converting the lactose-rich milk into a sour, fizzy, mildly alcoholic drink. Over several days, with continuous agitation and replenishment of fresh milk, the result was a IRAG. Imagine it. A young woman or grandmother sitting beside the fire, rhythmically punching the leather sack as children played nearby, or a tired herdsman returning at sunset, pausing to stir the fermenting brew with a wooden paddle before lifting the leather flap and checking its froth. This was not industry. It was life on a loop, with muscle memory and instinct guiding the process more than exact measurements. The result was a cloudy white liquid, slightly warm from the day's heat and the fermentation. It would bubble softly in the sack when stirred, a living drink, always evolving. Arag is economy. While largely consumed at home, Arag wasn't only for the family. It held economic and ceremonial value as well. During festivals or diplomatic gatherings, Arag was brought out in wooden bowls as a gesture of hospitality and honor. Guests were expected to sip, often from a communal vessel, and to finish the cup refusing might seem disrespectful, unless one was ill or abstaining for religious reasons. Excess Arag could be sold or traded, often in large volumes during Nadam, the summer celebration of Mongol culture featuring archery, wrestling, and horse racing. Vendors and herders would meet in makeshift marketplaces where Arag flowed freely, often ladled from massive barrels into travelers' flasks in times of surplus. Some Mongols would distill the leftover Arag into a stronger spirit called arkia, clear, potent liquor with even more bite. But for the most part, Arag was a seasonal treasure, a drink that belonged to summer, sweat, and steppe. The social web of milk. It is easy to think of milk production as a solitary chore. But on the Mongolian plains, it was a community act. Children helped gather foals. Young girls learned to churn from their mothers and grandmothers. Elders oversaw the process and declared when the Arag was ready. It was a shared labor. That became an identity. To be Mongol was to ride well, to live with the seasons, and to know when the milk had turned. And Arag was democratic. While meat was a luxury often saved for men or special events, Arag was for everyone a source of hydration and nourishment in a land where water sources were rare and rivers unreliable. The drink united rich and poor, old and young. Whether sipped from a carved wooden bowl or sloshed into a cracked leather cup, Arag was a thread of survival, woven through generations of steppe dwellers. The flavors of change. As the Mongol Empire expanded, so too did their foodways. Arag became not just a homegrown staple, but a cultural ambassador. Accounts from Persian emissaries and Chinese scribes described the drink with fascination. Many found it strange or off-putting. Others admired its effects, especially its light intoxication, which made people giddy without rendering them useless. Even Marco Polo tasted Arag during his time at the Mongol court. He called it like white wine, but sharp, and remarked that it made the warriors cheerful and ready for company. And still, the method of its making remained mysterious to outsiders. Part science, part tradition, part trust. For the Mongols, however, nothing was mysterious. The milk simply knew what to do if you gave it time, motion, and cared. By now, we've met the drink and the hands that made it. We've seen the tense, the churning, the flick of a mare's tail as milk flowed into wooden buckets. But history is not only made in households. It is forged in war, conquest, and empire. So how did a sour, lightly alcoholic beverage, produced in humble felt gears, become the fuel of an army that would ride farther and faster than any before it? In this section, we leave the hearth behind and enter the saddle, where fermented mare's milk transformed from nourishment into strategy. Marching on Erakth, Mongol horde was not like other armies. It did not lumber on foot or crawl on supply chains stretching miles behind it. It moved at blinding speed, over deserts and mountains, across snow and grass. Its warriors each rode with multiple horses, switching between them to preserve strength. And wherever the Mongols went, Arag came too, stored in leather pouches. Sloshing softly against saddlebags, Arag was the perfect marching ration. It was light, caloric, and hydrating. Its fermentation made it safe to drink long after raw milk would have spoiled. In a world before refrigeration, this was not merely convenient. It was revolutionary, unlike wheat or rice, which required cooking. Grinding, or access to water. Arag was ready as is. Soldiers could sip it while riding. A swig of Arag dulled hunger, quenched thirst, and even lifted spirits with its mild buzz. In cold months, it warmed the blood. In heat, it replenished salt lost to sweat. It was a mobile meal, one you didn't have to stop moving to enjoy. And perhaps most importantly, it was familiar. In the chaos of battle or the loneliness of foreign plains, the taste of Arag was home in the mouth. The Empire's engine modern armies run on logistics. The Mongol army ran on biology. Mongol warriors were often seen squeezing milk directly from a mare into a pouch, tying it to the saddle and letting it ferment with the movement of the horse. As they rode, the bouncing pouch agitated the milk, turning it into a basic form of Arag by the end of the day. Fermentation by gallop. This meant that food production didn't stop at home. It came along for the conquest. No need to wait for a caravan of wagons. No need to pillage villages for grain. The Mongol army brought its own biome, carried on hooves and in hides. Some generals, notably Subutai, the brilliant strategist who led campaigns across Eastern Europe, were said to have measured a campaign's readiness not just by arrows and scouts, but by milk production. A successful military push needed fresh foals, lactating mares, and skilled milkers. Strategy was not just maps and maneuvers. It was ecology. In many ways, the Mongol Empire was the first civilization to turn a beverage into a supply chain. Psychological. Warfare in a cup. There's an often repeated story told by Persian chroniclers. A Mongol ambassador, when asked what his people drank, offered a bowl of Arag to the foreign court. The courtiers, unused to the smell and taste, gagged. The ambassador smiled and said, "Your mouths are too delicate, and that is why your armies break when ours arrive." True or not, the anecdote captures something real. Arag was more than sustenance. It was symbol and separator. It marked who belonged to the world of the steppes, and who did not. To drink Arag was to say, "I do not fear discomfort. I have tamed beasts, ridden wind, and made food from hardship." What then? Is a fortress or a throne? This ethos of pride in endurance was part of what made the Mongol army so terrifying. They could ride days without rest. They carried no ovens, no wine, no cheese, no flour. Just milk, meat, and resilience. When European or Chinese armies captured Mongol provisions, they found little they could use. Hard dried meat, balls of curd, pouches of sour milk. It was a diet designed not for luxury, but for victory, strength. In simplicity, one could argue that the Mongols succeeded because they simplified everything. They wore clothes that didn't chafe or tear. They used composite boughs that worked in rain and snow. They read the land like scripture. And they drank. A food that did not require civilization to produce. Arag could not be taxed. It could not be monopolized by temples or states. It flowed from the animal and the earth, and it went where the herder went dot in a world of kingdoms, granaries, and delicate supply lines. The Mongol diet, and Arag in particular, was antiphratal. The more chaotic the world became, the more useful it was to drink something that needed no roads or rulers dot. This gave the Mongols a power few understood until it was too late. Their food was fast, and so they were faster. Their food was wild, and so they remained untamed dot in every sense. Arag was a weapon dot at the height of their empire. Mongol generals toasted victories with Arag poured from barrels bound in rawhide. In the heart of foreign cities, far from the steppes, they still drank the milk of their mothers' mares. And even as they conquered distant lands, they never left behind that ancient alchemy of motion, milk, and microbes. But empires do not last forever. In the next section, we follow the fate of Arag as the Mongol domains fractured, settled, and changed. What happened to the drink when horses gave way to cities and gears gave way to stone? Empires rise, empires fall, and yet, amid the ashes of conquest, certain customs persist, quiet, enduring, unassuming. The Mongol Empire shattered into fragments. In the centuries after its zenith, its sweeping cavalry tactics gradually made obsolete by gunpowder, walled cities, and bureaucratic states. But the drink of empire, that gently fizzing, slightly sour, protein-rich beverage, remained. Arag survived not through triumph, but through habit. From khanates to camps after Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the Mongol Empire fractured into semi-autonomous khanates, the Golden Horde in the northwest, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Each adapted to its local environment. Some Mongols settled in cities, some adopted Islam, others became patrons of Chinese arts. But almost all retained their taste for Mari's milk dot in the Golden Horde, which ruled over parts of what is now Russia and Ukraine. Arag became a symbol of continuity, a reminder of the steppe even as cities like Sarai were built. Court. Banquets featured Islamic dishes, Russian tribute, and Mongol Arag, often served in elaborate silver goblets. It was both a comfort and a statement. We drink our drink, even in foreign lands. In China, the story was different. Under the Yuan dynasty, 1271 to 1368, Mongol elites tried to hold on to their nomadic identity, even while ruling one of the most sedentary civilizations on Earth. The Chinese viewed the drink with suspicion. Sour, foreign, and unsuited to Confucian refinement. But in the imperial courts, small dairies were maintained by Mongol concubines and servants. Churning Arag for the elite dot, it was less common in the capital, but never forgotten. Chinese chroniclers referred to it as swan niu nai, sour cow milk, though they rarely grasped its equine origins. The very concept of drinking horse milk remained strange. Yet for Mongol lords perched atop Chinese thrones, it was a taste. Of the windswept homeland, the drink of margins as the centuries passed, the great khanates fell. The Yuan dynasty was replaced by the Ming. The Golden Horde splintered into warring principalities. And the descendants of the steppes either vanished into the populations they once ruled or retreated to the grasslands of their ancestors. Arag, too, retreated, not into oblivion, but into the margins dot in rural Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Mongolia. It never went away. Among shepherds and horse breeders, Arag remained the drink of the yurt, the camp, the feast. Nomadic families continued their centuries-old methods: foaling in spring, fermenting in summer, storing in bladders or wooden barrels, serving in bowls made of horn or bone dot, It was no longer the drink of emperors or generals, but it was still the drink of memory. Travelers in the 18th and 19th centuries reported being offered arag in distant valleys. Russian explorers, German linguists, and French diplomats all wrote about the curious milk that foamed in leather bags and tingled on the tongue. Most found it unpleasant. Some found it addictive. And in nearly every account, the offer of arag was paired with hospitality. The guests seated cross-legged near the fire, the bowl passed with two hands, the eyes, watching politely to see if the foreigner would finish it. It was a test, a welcome, a ritual. In a world of imperial decline and modernization, arag remained a kind of cultural handshake. Resisting modernity in the 20th century, arag faced a new kind of threat. Not swords or cannons, but progress. Under Soviet rule, traditional practices in Mongolia and Central Asia were discouraged, if not outright banned. Nomadism was viewed as backward. Soviet dairy programs promoted cow milk, industrial cheese, and pasteurized beverages. The methods of arag, open fermentation, animal skin storage, unmeasured wild bacteria, were labeled unsanitary. And yet, even in the collective farms and planned towns of Soviet Mongolia, some families held on. They whispered the old recipes. They brewed in secret. They taught their children not in schools, but in the quiet of summer pastures. In Mongolia, despite being a Soviet satellite, the drink never truly disappeared. It became an emblem of resistance, not political, but cultural. Even when Soviet, dairy stations opened across the countryside. Herders returned to their gers with barrels of Mare's milk. A bowl of arag became not just a drink, but a memory of freedom, a way of life untethered to state calendars or bureaucratic permission. One Soviet health official is recorded to have said in the 1950s, "The Mongols will give up smoking before they give up arag." He was not wrong. Arag in the 21st century today. Arag lives on, not on battlefields, but in festivals, weddings, and summer camps across Mongolia and parts of Central Asia. It is often the first thing offered to a guest in a nomadic home. Children learn to churn. Grandparents remember which tree gives the best wood for fermentation barrels. It's also big business. In Mongolia, entire communities earn income by selling arag during the summer festival season. Tourists flock too. Taste it. Some out of curiosity, others out of a longing for connection to a simpler world. Yet, it remains elusive. It cannot be bottled for long-term export. The living bacteria make it volatile, prone to explosion or spoilage. Attempts to industrialize it have largely failed. Unlike beer or wine, arag is not made in factories. It is made in families. Its taste still varies. Some batches sour, others smoother. One bowl may fizz wildly, another may fall flat, but every batch carries the trace of its maker, its horse, its pasture, and perhaps that is its secret. Arag refuses to become a product. It remains what it always was, a process, a partnership between woman and mare, between muscle and microbe. A modern Mongolian proverb puts it plainly: if the arag is good, the family is strong. Legacy in a cup. So what do we make of this? Cloudy drink, born in yurts, carried in saddlebags, fermented in motion? Arag is not just a beverage. It is history, culture, microbiology, and memory in one. It powered armies. It bound communities. It preserved traditions. It carried the taste of the steppe across continents and centuries. When you drink it, if you ever do, you are tasting a civilization not just in its glory, but in its persistence. You are tasting what it meant to live without cities, to move with the seasons, to trust in the strength of your animals and your hands. You are tasting the milk of survival. And as long as there are mares on the steppe, and herders who rise with the sun to milk them, arag will not die. As this story comes to a close, we return to our overarching question. how does something as humble as fermented horse milk shape the course of history? What other foods, drinks, or habits have traveled silently alongside empires, shaping the world not with fanfare, but with fermentation? In the next story, we turn from the grasslands to the Balkans, where an equally humble item, the clay amphora, quietly altered the fate of empires through trade, wine, and water. Story 2. The jar that crossed the sea before empires had walls, before cities had streets, before armies wore iron. There was clay. It was soft when wet, hard when baked, and infinitely shapeable. With it, early humans molded bowls, idols, ovens, and eventually amphorae. The tall, slender jars with two handles and a pointed base that would become one of history's most influential, yet invisible, technologies. The amphora was not born in glory. It was born in necessity. The shape of containment. The earliest known amphora-like vessels date back to the Neolithic period, around 5000 BCE, in the regions of Anatolia and the Fertile Crescent. These proto-jars were squat, round-bottomed, and used mostly for storing grain or water within villages. But as settlements became cities and trade began to flow between rivers, seas, and mountains, a new kind of vessel evolved, one that could move. The true amphora took shape in the Bronze Age, in civilizations around the Aegean Sea. Its key innovation was simple but profound: the pointed base. This feature allowed amphorae to be easily nestled in sand, clay racks, or ship holds. Onboard cargo vessels, they could be packed tightly, upright, or stacked, with little risk of tipping. Handles allowed for easy carrying. Narrow necks reduced spillage. The pointed base made it ideal for maritime trade, where flat-bottomed containers were unstable on shifting decks. The amphora wasn't just a jar. It was a technology of movement, the unseen infrastructure of empire. To understand how powerful the amphora would become, one must first grasp the nature of ancient commerce. Grain, oil, wine, fish sauce, dates, honey. These were the lifeblood of early cities. They fed armies, funded temples, and greased the gears of diplomacy. But they spoiled easily, spilled often, and needed to be shipped in bulk across rough terrain or stormy seas. Enter the amphora. In the palaces of Mycenaean Greece, storerooms were lined with giant storage jars, amphorae so large they had to be set in the ground. Each one held oil, wine, or precious perfume, a miniature vault of liquid value. By the time of the Phoenicians, around 1000 BCE, amphorae were not just vessels, but standardized cargo units. Their shape became more uniform, their size more predictable. A merchant in Tyre could load his ship with hundreds of amphorae filled with purple dye, olive oil, or salted fish, knowing they would stack neatly in the hold and survive. The journey to Cyprus or Carthage. And when the Greeks inherited this trade, they took the amphora to new heights, not only as a shipping tool, but as a medium of identity. Athenian amphorae bore black figure and red figure paintings of gods, athletes, and battles. They were works of art and declarations of culture, even when filled with something as mundane as wine. The Romans, as with so many things, perfected the system. By the 1st century BCE, Roman amphorae were mass-produced in state-run kilns, stamped with the names of factories, and used to ship garum, fermented fish sauce, oil from Hispania, and wheat from Egypt. Some Roman shipwrecks contained thousands of identical amphorae, each one carefully sealed with pitch and bearing titillally picty-painted labels describing contents, origin, and inspector's name. They were the shipping containers of antiquity, the amphora economy. What made the amphora so transformative wasn't just its function, it was how it shaped scale. With the amphora, goods could be measured, taxed, stored, and counted. 1 amphora of wine might be enough for a household for a month. 10 amphorae of oil might pay a soldier's annual salary. 50 could ransom a noble. In Roman ports, customs agents counted amphorae as part of imperial taxation. The vessels became units of statcraft. A shortage of amphorae in a region could signal crop failure. A sudden glut might mean war was brewing, and food stores were being stockpiled. Some emperors even controlled the distribution of amphorae to influence trade. In the time of Augustus, amphora shipments to Rome were monitored to ensure grain supplies remained stable. The containers became part of the logistical skeleton of empire, silent but vital. And still, they remained humble, breakable, replaceable, invisible. Their fragility was paradoxically their strength. Amphorae were made cheaply, used widely, and discarded freely. But in their short lives, they carried empires on their backs. A vessel of culture, it wasn't only commerce that amphorae carried. They carried stories done in Athenian society. Certain amphorae were used as prizes for athletic games. The Panathenaic amphora, tall, broad-shouldered, often painted with images of Athena and athletes, contained olive oil from sacred groves. Winning one was a mark of honor. To drink from one was to taste both victory and divinity. In burial rites, amphorae held wine or offerings for the dead. In homes, they were sometimes buried beneath thresholds to bring luck. In temples, they held oil for lamps or blood from sacrifices. They were used to transport rituals, not just goods. One shipwreck, found off the coast of Israel and dated to the 4th century BCE, contained amphorae filled not with wine or oil, but with delicately preserved rose petals, likely intended for use in perfumes or ceremonial garlands. The fragility of the flowers matched the fragility of the vessels. Yet somehow, across centuries and sea, both survived. Each amphora carried more than liquid. It carried intent. In the next section, we follow the amphora across the sea, into Roman colonies, North African markets, and the wine-soaked taverns of Londinium. We will see how this simple vessel continued to shape the daily life and imperial logistics of the West. It is one thing to invent a vessel. It is another to build a world around it. By the time the Roman Empire reached its peak, amphorae had transcended the boundaries of trade. They were no longer just the carriers of goods. They had become the infrastructure of daily life, the very bones of empire. And yet, for all their influence, amphorae remained mostly invisible. Shattered, buried, reused, forgotten. Their fragments littered the ancient world like dead leaves on a forest floor. But from those fragments, a story emerges. Not one of emperors or generals, but of dockhands, soldiers, innkeepers, and bakers. Of ordinary people whose lives were shaped by jars, Londiniums. Broken teeth walk the streets of modern London, and you walk upon ruins. Beneath the pavement of office parks and bus terminals lies the Roman city of Londinium. Founded around 47 CI, it was a colonial outpost, a trade hub, a military logistics center, and it was built upon amphorae. Literally. Archaeologists excavating Roman layers of London have uncovered piles of broken amphorae used as building material. Crushed shards were mixed into concrete foundations. Whole necks and handles were repurposed into drains. In taverns near the river docks, amphorae once stacked with wine or garum were smashed after use and buried beneath the floor to raise the ground, level against flooding. They called the wine Falernian, strong, sweet, and shipped from the slopes of Mount Falernus in Italy. It arrived in heavy, wide-shouldered amphorae marked with the letters FAL. A shipment to Londinium might carry thousands, packed in the hull of a flat-bottomed Roman freighter. By the time a legionary uncorked one in a smoky tavern, the jar had already traveled over 1,500 miles, from vineyard to ship to river port to wagon to city. When empty, the jar had no further value. It was smashed, buried, forgotten, but it was never gone. The Monte Testaccio in Rome. There is a hill with no name in ancient texts, no shrine or temple atop it. No myth to explain its rise. It is called Monte Testaccio, Mount Pottery Shard. It stands over 150 feet tall and spans nearly a kilometer in circumference, and it is made entirely of broken amphorae. Over 50 million of them. This was not a garbage heap. It was a state-managed facility where workers recorded and discarded the spent containers of Rome's commercial heart. Most of these amphorae carried olive oil from Hispania Baetica, modern-day Andalusia, a key source of fat for cooking, lighting, and religious use. Each jar was stamped with inscriptions: the producer, the tax official, the year, the weight of the contents. Rome knew its jars as it knew its roads, and when the oil was used in kitchens, bathhouses, or army camps, the amphora was brought here, emptied, broken, and methodically piled. Monte Testaccio is a mountain made of administration. It is a geological record of trade, of state control, of urban hunger. No other container in human history built a hill. Jars on the frontier beyond Rome's borders. Amphorae told different stories. Tales of risk, improvisation, and cultural exchange. In the far reaches of Dacia, Germania, and Britannia, Roman. Amphorae were found not just in military camps and cities, but in native settlements. There, they were repurposed, cut into bowls, used to store seeds, turned into makeshift chimneys. Some local artisans even imitated Roman amphorae, creating hybrid forms that blended indigenous shapes with imperial function. The jar became a diplomatic object, a symbol of contact, conquest, or commerce. In the desert outposts of North Africa, amphorae served another critical role: water transport. In arid provinces like Tripolitania or Numidia, soldiers and merchants relied on specially sealed amphorae to move drinking water across scorching terrain. The same jar that once carried garum in Spain now carried life in the Sahara. To cross the empire was to see amphorae not just as vessels, but as adaptable architecture, the Lego bricks of an ancient world, the silent language of trade to the fillet to the Myagimton. Untrained eye, ancient amphorae all look alike. Terracotta bodies, narrow necks, twin handles. But to Roman merchants, these differences were a language. Each amphora type had a code. Dressel 1, Dressel 20, Dressel 7 to 11, a modern system named after German archaeologist Heinrich Dressel, who cataloged hundreds of forms. The system reveals how each shape correlated to a region, commodity, and era. Dressel 1, large, narrow amphora used for wine from Italy in the 2nd century BCE. Dressel 20, bulbous form used for Spanish. Olive oil in the early empire. Dressel 7 to 11. Small jars used for garum and fish products. These weren't just containers. They were identifiers. A port inspector could look at the jars unloaded from a ship and know, without unsealing them, where they came from, what they carried, and whether customs had been paid. It was a visual language of logistics, a grammar of empire. Amphorae. As clues in the 21st century, archaeologists treat amphorae not as artifacts, but as data. By mapping the distribution of amphora types, researchers reconstruct trade routes, economic shifts, and even dietary trends. A sudden drop in Dressel 20 finds in Britain might signal a disruption in Spanish oil exports, perhaps due to war, plague, or drought. In this way, broken jars become historical seismographs, registering the shocks of famine, invasion, and imperial collapse. Amphorae also speak to the rhythms of daily life. From Egypt to Gaul, graffiti scratched onto amphorae tells of merchants, jokes, curses, and prayers. One amphora found near Pompeii bears the words, "Hic habitat felicitatis." Happiness lives here. A jar may be mute, but not silent. In the next section, we explore the amphora's second life after the fall of the empire, as a hidden technology, an archaeological language, and eventually as a symbol of timeless human connection through trade. When an empire dies, it leaves behind its bones. Amphorae are among the most enduring of these, not as monuments, but as debris. The fall of Rome did not end the story of the jar. In some ways, it began a new one. The amphora was a survivor, not of bloodlines or dynasties, but of material permanence. It weathered the collapse of cities, the silence of ports, the retreat of legions. And in the quiet centuries that followed, the jar was reborn, not in kilns, but in fields, foundations, and memory. A jar in the soil in 1954. A farmer in southern France plowed up a shard of pottery in his vineyard. He had turned up dozens before, and this one seemed no different. Reddish clay, part of a handle, a few faint scratches. He tossed it aside. Later, a local archaeologist picked it up and noticed something unusual. Stamped letters in Latin, partially legible. Vibi. L. Felix. That name matched a known Roman oil producer from Hispania, dating to the late 1st century CE. What the farmer had unearthed, without knowing, was part of a Dressel 20 amphora that had once carried olive oil from Spain to Gaul, consumed by someone long forgotten, buried beneath vines that would one day make wine for a different world. Such finds are common in Mediterranean landscapes. In fields, gardens, wells, and even graveyards, amphorae sleep beneath the surface. Fragments of a lost system that still shapes the soil. In parts of Tunisia and Sicily, crushed amphorae were mixed into agricultural terraces, enriching the soil with minerals, providing drainage, even marking ancient property lines. The jar never stopped being useful. It simply changed roles. Jars. In the abyss, not all amphorae were buried. Some were lost at sea in the last 2 centuries. As diving technology advanced, a new kind of archive began to emerge from the depths. Shipwrecks. And with them, jars. Thousands of amphorae now lie, silent on the seafloor, stacked in ghostly formations, still in the hold of vessels that sank 2,000 years ago. These were not garbage dumps. They were frozen moments of catastrophe. The Madia wreck off the coast of Tunisia carried amphorae of wine and art, objects meant for a Roman villa. The Ionissos wreck in the Aegean was a massive freighter bearing hundreds of jars. Still intact, the Grand Convoi shipwreck near Marseille held amphorae whose residues still contained trace oils and resins. What had once been mass-produced packaging was now archaeological treasure, a kind of time capsule for marine historians. The jars told not just what was traded, but how, where, and by whom. Using chemical analysis, scientists have even identified the residue of contents, pinpointing grape varietals, fish species, and the chemical markers of olive oil oxidation. In the jar's walls, an empire is encoded. Resurrection in a museum by the 19th century. Amphorae began to appear in museums across Europe. Excavated from Roman villas, retrieved from shipwrecks, or purchased from local diggers, they were cleaned, reconstructed, labeled, and displayed behind glass. But something changed in this process. The amphora was no longer a tool, but an object, a symbol of antiquity, removed from its purpose, admired for its form rather than its function. In rooms lined with marble and brass, the jar became part of a narrative of civilization, a silent stand-in for empire, order, and classical grandeur. Few visitors stopped to ask how many thousands of these existed, how many hands had touched them, how many backs had ached under their weight. The museum turned the amphora from infrastructure to art, and in doing so, it detached it from the people who had made it essential. And yet, in these halls, the jar gained new power. The power to connect. A visitor might trace their fingers along its curved shoulder and imagine the Roman merchant who once sealed it, or the sailor who stowed it deep in a hull, or the cook who poured out its oil onto a pan of lentils and leeks. The jar, broken or whole, became a portal. The jar as metaphor by the 20th century. The amphora had entered literature and philosophy. Writers saw in it a symbol of fragility, of permanence, of memory. The poet George Sepphoris wrote, "Wherever I go, Greece wounds me with a jar buried in the soil." Philosopher Gaston Bachelor meditated on jars in the poetics of space, imagining them not merely as containers, but as inner worlds, wombs, chambers of imagination, the architecture of memory. And in modern novels, the amphora appears again and again, unearthed in post-war ruins, salvaged in underwater dives, whispered about in the dreams of archaeologists. The jar, once anonymous, had become a character. Digital resurrections in our time, the amphora has entered yet another life, a digital one. Across universities and research institutes, amphorae are being scanned, modeled, and entered into global databases. Projects like the Roman Amphorae Database or the Portus Project have mapped thousands of finds, each one geotagged, photographed, and cataloged. Machine learning tools now analyze amphora distribution patterns, tracing climate events, warfare, and economic shifts across time. The jar, long silent, is now part of a chorus of data. Some researchers even experiment with 3D printing ancient amphorae, not as replicas, but as tools to test historical hypotheses, how they stacked, how they poured, how many fit in a Rama. Ship's hull. The amphora has joined the cloud, but unlike many ancient tools, weapons, coins, jewelry, the jar resists luxury. It was never precious. It was always ordinary, and it is precisely this ordinariness that makes it immortal. It reminds us that civilization is not made only by kings and priests and poets, but by packers, potters, porters, and pickers, people whose lives flowed through the mouths of jars. Next, in the final section of this story, we'll explore the amphora's timeless legacy, how it became a symbol for all containers, how its DNA lives on in every bottle and crate, and why the story of human trade is, in some sense, the story of the jar. We no longer carry oil in clay. We no longer seal amphorae with pitch and rope, but we carry their ghost. The amphora is not dead. It has simply evolved, its form reshaped, its material updated, but its purpose unchanged: to contain, to transport, to connect. If you hold a wine bottle in your hand, you are holding a descendant. If you open a can of tomatoes, you are performing an ancient rite. If you stack shipping containers at a port, you are echoing the geometry of Rome. This is the quiet legacy of the jar. The inheritance of form. The amphora's shape was not arbitrary. It was refined over centuries to serve function above all. The taper base allowed it to nest tightly in ship holds, upright in sand or soft earth. The long neck slowed pouring, reducing spillage and spoilage. The looped handles allowed for ropes, arms or hooks, versatile grip for merchant or mule. The standard sizes enabled taxation, trade, and logistics across empires. When glass and tin replaced clay, when trucks replaced ox carts, and when barrels and crates became the new norm, the jar's design language persisted. Even today, the standardized sizes of modern shipping containers, TEU's 20-foot equivalents, follow the same logic. Efficiency, stackability, are EPA, BI, LITY. Just as amphorae once bore stamps of origin and contents, modern boxes are marked with QR codes and barcodes, scannable metadata for global systems. Jar lives on in algorithms and airport tarmacs, in cargo manifests and supermarket shelves. The shape in our hands. The wine bottle, in particular, is the amphora's clearest air. Its glass curves mimic the ancient silhouette. Its neck is narrow, its base sable. It is often stored horizontally, but always designed for vertical dignity. Unlike its ancestor, it carries more than liquid. It carries meaning of place, of quality, of ritual. To uncork a bottle is to participate in a ceremony that once belonged to temples and taverns. To toast is to echo ancient libations once poured from painted jars into the dust for forgotten gods. Even our language bears the jar's residue. We say something has spilled over. A jar without discipline. We speak of people as empty vessels or full of potential. We label projects as containers of knowledge or meaning. These metaphors are not decorative. They are structural. The jar shaped how we think. A vessel of memory. Every civilization builds some version of the jar. In Egypt, they held perfume and grain. In Mesopotamia, they bore beer and cuneiform tablets. In China, porcelain jars crossed borders centuries before Marco Polo. In the Andes, the Mocha made stirrup-spouted jars that told stories with their forms. The Roman amphora stands out not for being unique, but for being ubiquitous. Its survival in such great numbers makes it the most democratic artifact of the ancient world. Coins were rare, statues fewer, but amphorae? Millions. We can map Roman life more clearly through jars than through generals. We know what they ate. We know what they valued. We know how they moved through the world. Archaeologists now use amphora fragments, potsherds, to date layers of time, like tree rings. Each style corresponds to a period, a region, a trade. Root. The jar has become a clock that tells us not just about Rome, but about the world Rome touched. The ghost in the shell. But the amphora is not only history. It is a shape of longing. We design urns for ashes in similar silhouettes. We craft vases to hold flowers and curves that mirror ancient elegance. We place time capsules in metal canisters, hoping someone will someday unseal them, like a message in a bottle or a letter from antiquity. We are still a species of containers. We put meaning into boxes. We archive memories in clouds and jars. Of jam in folders of photographs. The jar teaches us something elemental. To preserve is to believe in tomorrow. To store olive oil against a future hunger is to trust that someone will open it. To send goods across a sea is to believe in arrival. To place wine in a bottle is to say, this moment too is worth saving. The amphora is faith-made ceramic. The jar in the stars. There is one last echo. When NASA sends spacecraft into deep space, it often places golden records or sealed archives aboard. Messages for unknown intelligences, hoping to survive the collapse of everything else. These are jars. In the truest, most mythic sense. Vessels of meaning sealed against time, hurled across a vast sea, not of salt, but of stars. In this way, the amphora has not only crossed the Mediterranean, it has crossed epochs, continents, species, and now perhaps the cosmos. And if one day a distant being opens such a container and hears the voices of our planet, music, laughter, greetings in many tongues, then the jar will have completed its final voyage. Not as clay, not as glass, but as the eternal idea of a thing meant to hold something precious until it is needed again. This is the legacy of the jar. It is not heroic. It is not beautiful, but it is enduring. The amphora reminds us that civilization is not built by epics alone. It is built by systems, by tools, by the humble miracles of storage and structure. By those who carry, by those who wait, by those who seal the lid and say, this will matter later. And they were right, because thousands of years later, we are still opening them. Story 3. The city that ate stone. It did not begin with war. It began with a footprint, a trail worn into the earth by bare solace and calloused hooves. A path between watering holes, between fields and forests, between a village and its nearest neighbor. This was the first road. And then it was remade. Not with footprints, but with stone. The invention of the unnatural path. To a Rama, a road was not just a way to go from place to place. It was a way to stay in control. Before Rome, roads followed the contours of the land, winding with rivers, skirting hills, bending with terrain. But Roman roads cut through. They conquered. Hills were carved down. Marshes were drained. Mountains were pierced. Roman surveyors, called agrimensors, used tools like the groma and the corybates to impose mathematical straightness on the world. The roads did not meander. They declared, where there had once been dirt, they laid gravel. Where there had once been gravel, they pressed stone. And when the world refused to bend, they built arches, bridges, tunnels, teeth and claws of a machine called empire. The road became a technology of domination. Via Appia and the bones beneath. Consider the Via Appia, Rome's queen of roads. It stretched from the city's gates all the way to Brundisium on the Adriatic, over 300 miles in a line so unbending it seemed unnatural. And perhaps it was to build it. Rome requisitioned labor. Soldiers dug. Slaves hauled. Engineers calculated. The roadbed was laid in layers. Stadamen, large stones for foundation. Rudus, crushed gravel. Nucleus, finer gravel and sand. Summum dorsum, polygonal paving stones fitted so tightly you couldn't slip a knife between them. This was not a trail. It was a spine. And beneath it, bones. Because every road cost something. The Via Appia saw the crucifixion of 6,000 slaves after the rebellion of Spartacus. Their bodies nailed along the roadside as warnings, turning the route into a corridor of agony. Rome paved with stone. But it was blood that held the mortar. The road as a weapon. The genius of Roman roads was not just their engineering. It was their purpose. Troops could move quickly. Legions dispatched across vast territory with terrifying speed. Messages traveled by cursus publicus, the imperial postal system, with relay stations every 10 to 15 miles. Merchants followed in their wake, turning remote outposts into marketplaces. A road meant that wherever Rome went, Rome remained. It carried language, law, measurement, architecture, coinage, the whole grammar of civilization, stamped in basalt and lime. To destroy a city was one thing. To connect, it was worse. Because once the road was built, it became harder to forget who ruled you. The road didn't just move soldiers. It moved identity. The network of control at its peak. Rome had over 250,000 miles of roads. About 50,000 miles were paved in stone. They radiated from the Miliarium Aureum, the golden milestone in the Roman Forum, outward like the spokes of a wheel. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," was not metaphor. It was infrastructure. Each road bore a name. Each had its own mile markers. Each connected provinces to governors, governors to emperors, and emperors to the restless edges of the world. The roads had order, and that order was not just physical. It was psychological. To walk on a Roma road was to feel the weight of system. You were not alone. You were on a path others had built, others had walked, others had taxed, patrolled, mapped, and recorded. You were part of something vast. Something that did not ask permission. Something that ate landscapes and gave back Rome. Where the stones go silent, but nothing eats forever. As Rome declined, the roads remained. And for a time, they still served, repurposed by Goths and Franks, pilgrims and popes, merchants and monks. But eventually, the maintenance stopped. The mile markers faded. The relay stations collapsed. Grass took root between the stones. Cart. Wheels wore ruts. The spine began to slump. Yet even then, they lingered. Because roads, once built, are hard to forget. Villages still grew near them. Markets still followed their lines. Even new roads traced their old paths, because Roman judgment of terrain was so precise that it rarely made sense to reinvent. And so, the ghost of the empire remained beneath the feet of generations who no longer remembered. who built the stones they walked on. The road did not just conquer. It outlived dot if a Roman road was a spine. Then, its cities were the organs, pulsing with grain, tax, and rumor. The empire was not just a map of conquest. It was a network, a body. And bodies, once formed, must feed. They must breathe. They must transport heat and knowledge. They must endure decay. This is what Rome built, not merely a collection of cities, but a circulatory system of power. The stones did not lie flat. They carried dot the rhythm of the stones, traveling on a Roman road in the 2nd century CE. You would have felt the beat of empire beneath your sandals. Every 20 miles or so, you'd find a mansio, a roadside inn maintained by the state. These were not taverns, not truly. They were official relay stations, part of the cursus publicus, where imperial messengers could change horses, eat, rest, and send dispatches faster than the wind dot between the mansios. There were mutations, stables, where you could swap mounts. Everything was planned, engineered. Timed dot soldiers had marching routes. Caravans had schedules. Tax collectors had deadlines. Even stone had an itinerary. Quarried in the hills, dragged in carts, laid by masons who left behind chisels and curse. Tablets in the margins of the earth. The road was not just to go somewhere. It was to keep the system alive. Cities as mouths Rome itself, the beating heart, consumed at a pace few cities have rivaled dot by the early imperial period. Over 1 million people lived in the city. It required 500,000 tons of grain per year, tens of thousands of amphorae of oil and wine slaves, from the Balkans marble, from Asia Minor spices, from Syria papyrus, from Egypt, and every item, every drop of olive oil, was transported over roads dot the grain fleet might sail from Alexandria. Yes. But once it reached Puteoli or Ostia, the carts rolled inward. Heavy wheels grinding the stone, animals sweating, road dust coating the barrels. If you imagine Rome as a mouth, the roads were its throat. And the cities beyond, Capua, Narbo, Londinium, Antioch, were the organs feeding it. Cities could not be islands. They could not survive without their roads. And so, even conquered peoples, even resentful provinces, found themselves building and maintaining the very arteries that fed their oppressor. They did it because they had to. The geometry of survival. The farther a city was from Rome, the more vital its connectivity became. A remote city, like Lugdon, modern Lyon, depended on the roads to stay relevant. It needed to receive shipments, process taxes, deliver troops, send reports. A city that lost its connection was a city that would wither dot. So city leaders, even in Gallic or Iberian towns that had once fought Rome, became roadkeepers. They maintained milestones, repaired pavement, and sometimes even funded road construction. Themselves in return for imperial favor, dot to be on the road was the matter. To be off, it was to be forgotten dot life along the edges. For ordinary people, the roads were both lifeline and menace. Farmers carted olives and grain to market. Traveling teachers sought students in cities far from home. Physicians, often Greek, moved town to town, bringing herbs and tools in wooden chests. Actors and gladiators followed seasonal circuits, sleeping under the same stars as soldiers. Pilgrims later traced the same roads to Christian shrines. But with traffic came danger. Bandits waded in the forests. Bribes were paid at toll points. Weary feet blistered. Cartwheels cracked. And still, they walked dot because to not be on the road was to fall into the margins. To miss opportunity? To be unreachable dot when roads became burdens by the 4th century CE. The Roman road system was no longer a glory. It was a liability. The roads still functioned. Many still bore the name of Augustus or Claudius. But the empire itself had changed. Civil wars fractured regions. Tax burdens exploded. Maintenance became sporadic. Once the empire had built with pride. Now it patched with desperation. Provincial cities began to contract inward, drawing walls tighter, abandoning suburbs, fearing the very roads that once brought goods and letters, because now they brought invaders. Germanic tribes moved along. These roads too. So did rebel legions. So did messengers bearing news of betrayal, of defeat, of a distant emperor deposed again. The veins still pulsed. But the blood was poisoned hot when roads led nowhere after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In 476 CE, many cities along the road network collapsed. Aqueducts dried. Forums emptied. The stones still lay in their straight lines, but few followed them now. Some cities, like Ravenna, survived as imperial ghost towns, mausoleums with mosaics. Others, like Londinium, shrank so much that medieval London would be built off to the side, not atop the Roman city, as if the old stones were best left buried. And yet, pilgrims still traveled on the Via Francigena. Charlemagne still used the bones of Rome to organize his empire. Crusaders marched across Roman bridges in Hispania. Traders in medieval France followed Roman way stations, unaware of the stones beneath. Their feet had been quarried 15 centuries earlier. The roads had lost their empire, but they had not lost their path. Endurance in dust, perhaps. The most fascinating thing about the Roman road network is how long it refused to die. Even today, the A1 autostrada in Italy follows the path of the old Via Flaminia. In Britain, Watling Street is now the A2 and A5. In France, parts of the A9 hug the old Via Dom Itia. What does this say? It says that Rome, in its obsession with geometry, terrain, and durability, understood something deep, perhaps deeper than intended. A good road does not just carry people. It carries possibility. And once that line is carved into the land, it becomes difficult, sometimes impossible. To UNMAKE. In the next section, we'll explore what the legacy of these roads became after empire, how Christian pilgrims, medieval kings, and Renaissance scholars repurposed them, how roads became both monuments and mysteries. Embedded in the soil of time, the stones lie still now, some buried beneath centuries of earth and memory, others worn smooth by the tires and footsteps of modernity. But these stones, once the backbone of a vast empire, still guide us. They are the skeleton upon which much of Europe's modern infrastructure is built. And they remind us that roads, once tools of conquest, become paths of continuity. Medieval travelers and the ghosts of Rome after the empire's collapse. Europe fragmented. Kingdoms rose and fell like tides. Yet the ancient roads built with precision and pride did not simply vanish. They became the paths of pilgrims walking towards Santiago de Compostela, monks spreading new ideas and faith, merchants carrying cloth and salt across uncertain lands. Despite the crumbling cities and shifting borders, the Roman roads persisted, guiding feet and carts alike. This was no accident. Medieval chroniclers often lamented the decay of the old world, but relied heavily on its infrastructure. Maps of the era frequently marked Roman roads as the safest and most reliable routes, even if those roads were little more than rough tracks, patched by local villagers. The endurance of these roads shaped medieval life in subtle ways, improving trade, encouraging communication, and fostering a sense of connectedness that was crucial to the slow rebirth of Europe. Renaissance reverence and rediscovery. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was awakening. Scholars like Petrarch and later humanists gazed upon the ruins of Rome with awe and longing. Ancient roads were no longer just pathways. They were symbols of a lost golden age. During this time, the remnants of Roman roads began to be carefully studied, mapped, and preserved. Renaissance engineers borrowed heavily from Roman construction techniques. Realizing that durability and planning mattered, the Via Appia, the Queen of Roads, became a pilgrimage site and a symbol of enduring engineering prowess. Travelers and cartographers, equipped with new instruments, began to chart the old roads with surprising accuracy, ensuring they would not be lost to history. Modern roads and ancient footprints fast forward to the 18th and 19th centuries, the age of industrialization and empire. With new technologies, railroads, steam engines, and later automobiles came a renewed interest in efficient routes. Planners and engineers often found the old Roman roads to be ideal starting points. In England, the famed turnpike trusts often upgraded Roman roads instead of building new ones from scratch. In Italy, the state highway system honored many ancient Roman routes, paving over stones that had borne the weight of chariots, soldiers, and traders for 2 millennia. The same could be said for France, Spain, and Germany. Thus, the invisible hand of Rome still shaped the modern world's veins and arteries. Lessons from the stones. What can the story of Roman roads teach us beyond engineering? Longevity and vision. Rome's roads were built not for short-term convenience, but for lasting impact. They remind us that infrastructure investments can shape societies far beyond their creators' lifetimes. Connectivity and power. The roads show us how connectivity can both unify and control. They fed the empire's power, but also helped preserve knowledge, commerce, and culture, passing through dark ages and rebirths, resilience and adaptation. Even when the empire fell, the roads adapted to new purposes: pilgrimage, trade, migration, showing human resilience and the repurposing of tools across eras. The quiet power of boring history. You might wonder why the story of stones and roads matters today. After all, roads are so common they barely merit notice. They are ordinary, dull even. But beneath their monotony lies history's heartbeat. Each mile of Roman road is a thread connecting us to distant ancestors who planned, built, and lived in a world both foreign and foundational to ours. They carried soldiers and scholars, farmers and pilgrims, merchants and monarchs. They bore witness to the slow, grinding story of survival, expansion, decline, and rebirth. And perhaps, as you rest now listening to this story, you might ponder this. What roads do we build today that will outlast us? How will future travelers interpret the stones we lay down? Story 4. A Plague in the Fields. How medieval peasants survived the Black Death. They saw it first in the sky, in the summer of 1348. The sun seemed duller, the winds hotter. The animals, goats, sheep, and chickens grew restless. Even the church bells rang with a strange delay, as if sound itself had slowed to watch what was coming. And then came the smell. Some said it was sulfur. Others claimed it was the scent of the sea. Though the village of Bridling Fen lay 100 miles inland, the dogs howled. The birds flew low, and the fields, golden and full of barley, seemed to stand unnaturally still in the windless dusk. But the people, poor, tired, and mostly illiterate, did what they had always done. They worked, because plague or not, a man's fields don't tend themselves. The peasants of England, in the 14th century, lived close to the bone, not just in poverty, but in proximity to the soil, the sky, the animals, and death. They were bound to their manors, villages, or hamlets grouped around a local lord's hall or church tower. In most cases, they worked someone else's land, growing barley, oats, and wheat. They owed labor to the manor, 3 days a week at least, plus taxes in kind, such as eggs, wool, or cheese. They lived in timber-framed homes with wattle and daub, walls and thatched roofs, sometimes shared with pigs or chickens. Floors were earth. Windows were cloth. The hearth smoked endlessly, and the only real heat came from sleeping close to family and livestock. Life was narrow, predictable, grueling, but it was not always hopeless. There were feast days, saints' festivals, ale brewed in the spring, and for those with sturdy backs and few enemies, a life could be lived well into one's 40s until, of course, the pestilence came. It did not arrive with a roar, but a whisper, a merchant's cart from the coast laden with wool sacks, a friar traveling between parishes, a wandering musician who sang of death and dreams. The first death in Bridling Fen was a girl named Eliza, age 7. She had picked apples for her mother and died the next morning, skin darkened, tongue swollen. The villagers buried her near the hedgerow, with the vicar saying a hurried prayer and the wind carrying the sound of coughing from every direction. By the week's end, 5 were gone. By month's end, half the village. You may think that in the face of such devastation, the world would stop. But in truth, it did not. The peasants still rose before dawn. They still milked their cows and mucked their stalls. Even the dying tried to finish their tasks, for it was said that unfinished work would chain a soul to the earth. Old Moreland, the plowman, dug a final trench before collapsing beside his ox. Mara, the miller's wife, baked 4 loaves after, burying her husband and 2 sons. Survival was not noble or glorious. It was habit, grit, the dull, repetitive rhythm of labor that outlasts even grief. The church, once a pillar, faltered by the middle of 1349. Most of the clergy were dead, or fled. The vicar of Bridling Fen tried to bury every body properly, but soon he too was coughing blood and whispering scripture to himself in an empty nave. One peasant, Hob Tolland, took over his duties. Hob couldn't read, but he remembered enough. Latin to chant psalms and wave incense over the mass graves. They buried the dead near the fields, because there was no more room in the graveyard, and because the earth was softer where barley had grown. Sometimes the bodies moved in the night, not because they were alive, but because the rats that lived beneath them were rumors came in from distant villages. Some said the plague was punishment for sin. Others blamed foreign merchants. A few muttered that it came from a star that fell into the sea. Peasants rarely traveled more than 10 miles from their homes, but stories traveled faster than carts did, and in these stories, a strange hope began to grow. That maybe, just maybe, the plague would kill enough people to free them from forced labor, from rent, from the lash of the reeve and the whims of the Lord. No one said it aloud at first, but the thought took root in silence, like rye in a fallow field. And so they endured. They brewed potions of sage, vinegar, and garlic. They wore dried flowers around their necks. They burned sweet-smelling wood and hung herbs in doorways. Some bathed. Others avoided water entirely, believing it opened the pores. To illness, children were kept indoors. Pigs roamed freely. And when all else failed, the peasants did what they always did. They looked to the land. Because if the barley still grew, if the cow still gave milk, if the hens still laid eggs, then life, no matter how fragile, could go on. By the end of 1349, 2/3 of Bridling Fen was gone. But those who remained knew something had changed. The fields were still. The manor hall was silent. And the reeve, the man who once whipped them for lateness, was buried in a ditch with his boots stolen by a shepherd. For the first time in generations, the survivors looked around and saw something strange. The land was empty. The fields were theirs. No lord came to collect rent. No clerk counted bushels. They had nothing. And yet, they had everything. In the next section, we will explore what the survivors did with this unexpected freedom, how scarcity created opportunity, and how laborers, once bound in servitude, began to shape the terms of their own lives. They say that absence makes the heart grow fonder. But in 1350, across much of Europe, absence made something else entirely: opportunity. when the Black Death loosened its grip on England in the early 1350s, what remained was a quiet countryside, less a land at peace, more a field after fire. Smoldering, ashen, waiting in places like Bridling Fen, where over 2/3 of the population had perished. This absence became the defining feature of life. The markets were quieter, the fields overgrown, and the manorial rolls once bursting with names, debts, fines, and obligations were now thin parchment, marked mostly by inked-out lines. The land remained, but the people to work it had vanished. And suddenly, for those who had survived, the rules began to bend. The medieval manor was never just a plot of land. It was a closed system, a fuel machine of duties, rents, customs, and hierarchy. Peasants, sometimes free, often not owed labor in exchange for access to strips of land or common pastures. They paid in coin when they could, in goods when they could not. Before the plague, lords had the upper hand. Laborers were many. Land was limited. If a peasant complained, the reeve could fine him. If he tried to leave, he might be branded or chased down. But after the plague, the entire economic equation reversed. Now, it was the lords who were desperate. Across England, noble families sat in cold, crumbling halls, their laborers gone. Their fields manors that once produced hundreds of bushels of wheat yielded only thistles. Orchards fell into ruin. Livestock roamed unmilked and unguarded. Churches stood empty, their bells silent. And so, with mounting pressure, the great and powerful turned to those they once overlooked. The survivors, the laborers who remained. People like Hob Tolland, the grave digger turned field hand, and Mara the widow baker, now working 3 plots of land alone. They were no longer invisible. Now they were invaluable, with demand high and supply low. Peasants began to do something previously unthinkable. They bargained. A man like Hob might be offered an entire cottage and strip of arable, land in a neighboring village, simply to agree to live and work there. Lords offered better wages, freer terms, or even forgiveness of past debts. A plowman could earn what a bailiff once did. Young women found they could negotiate dowries and rights that had once been entirely out of reach. Some left their home. Manors entirely illegally, yes, but often with no one left to stop them. The rules of feudalism cracked, not because of war or revolution, but because there simply weren't enough people left to uphold them. This shift was most visible in 2 places: the manor court and the harvest field. In the manor court, the old routines faltered. Fines for absence went unpaid. Fees for bread ovens or pasturage were quietly ignored. The lords might protest, but even their stewards grew cautious. Who would collect these fees? And from whom? If you pressed too hard, the few tenants you had left might simply walk away. In the fields, the labor dynamic changed entirely. Men and women could demand silver pennies per day. They could ask for shorter hours, more meat in their rations, and even breaks during harvest. It wasn't a revolution with swords and fire. It was a quiet rebellion, measured in hours worked and loaves earned. In 1351, King Edward III issued a response, the Statute of Laborers. This law attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and forbid laborers from moving between manors. But paper and law only go so far when reality has shifted. Enforcement was erratic. Local lords either ignored the law or used it to press negotiations. Laborers scoffed. Officials found themselves chasing ghosts across the countryside. In many places, the statute was little more than ink on vellum, irrelevant in a land where the barley still needed reaping, and the men to reap it had choices. Back in Bridling Fen, Hob Tolland now oversaw 5 strips of land that once belonged to his neighbors. 2 claimed from an abandoned manor a day's walk away. Mara's bakery grew into something closer to a business. She traded with travelers and even hired a younger cousin from another village. The fields were still quiet, but not lifeless. Peasants began to think generationally. They built sturdier homes. Some married for land, not just affection. They taught. Their children letters rare, but increasingly valued Dot, and though the church warned of sin and upheaval, the people knew something profound had occurred. They had tasted independence, and it was not so bitter as they'd been told. This shift had ripple effects far beyond the hedgerows. The cloth industry, especially wool, boomed as laborers now had wages to spend. Markets expanded. Towns grew. The seeds of a true wage. Economy began to take root, and socially something stirred. Though the nobles still ruled and the peasants still worked, the illusion of divine, unchanging hierarchy had been shaken. If a reeve could die coughing in the street and a plowman rise to steward the land, what else might change? But not all was gained. With new freedoms came new dangers. Enclosures dash, where lords fenced off formerly common land for sheep grazing, accelerated in the century to follow, displacing many. Some lords, unable to compete, sold or abandoned their holdings. The gap between those who survived well and those who barely did widened. A rural middle class began to emerge, but so did a new wave of displaced laborers with no land at all. Still, compared to the rigid, immobile world before the plague, this was a time of motion, of change, of possibility. And for peasants, like those of bridling fen, it was a rare moment when history turned its gaze not to kings or castles, but to them. As the 1360s rolled in, many of the fields once filled with bodies were filled with barley again. But the people planting it walked with a little more certainty, a little more confidence, because the rules had been broken. And once broken, they could not be fully mended. In the final section of this story, we will look at the long arc of legacy, how the children of plague survivors carried forward a quiet revolution, and how the landscape of rural England and the very idea of freedom changed as a result. By the time the last grave mounds had settled back into the earth, by the time the weeds had grown over the thresholds of long empty cottages, something peculiar had taken root in England. It was not revolution. Not yet. It was not prosperity either, at least not for all. But it was something quieter, slower, and perhaps more enduring. It was change. And it began, not with lords or statutes, but with the children of the survivors, those born in the wake of the Black Death, who never knew the world before it. In Bridling Fen, as in thousands of other villages across the English countryside, the next generation grew up with gaps in their stories. Gaps where cousins should have been. Gaps where the reeve no longer barked orders. Gaps where the church once rang its bells every morning. There were fewer people, but there was more space, more land, and more memory. Young Will Tolland, son of Hob, grew up running through barley. Fields that had once belonged to 3 separate households, now farmed together. He learned to sow, scythe, and repair a plow, but he also learned how to count sacks of grain, to barter for salt, and even to read the prayers scratched on the vicar's old wooden tablet. No one had taught his father these things, but Will learned them because the world required it. By the late 14th century, something else began to spread. Restlessness. Young men and women, no longer tied to manors as rigidly as before, took to the roads. Some worked as hired hands, moving from manor to manor during harvest seasons. Others joined trades in market towns or took service in minor, noble households. The idea that one must remain where one was born, on one's assigned strip of land, under the shadow of one's assigned lord, began to weaken. The plague had wiped away many things. It had also wiped away many constraints. The English peasant was, in small but growing ways, becoming a person who moved. This mobility was not just physical. It was mental, spiritual, cultural. In the old days, Most peasants accepted that their place in the world was fixed, that God had ordained the high and the low, and that it was a sin to disturb that order. But in the wake of so much death, certainty frayed. Why had the pious died and the wicked lived? Why had entire monasteries perished, while a hedge witch at the edge of the village survived untouched? Young minds questioned. And with questioning came discontent. Some of it was quiet, a refusal to bow, a delay in rent, a snort at a sermon. But some of it burned hot. In 1381, this slow simmer erupted. The peasants' revolt sparked by oppressive taxes, wage restrictions, and anger at corrupt officials swept through the south of England like a sudden summer storm. Villages emptied. Rebels marched on London. They demanded the end of serfdom, the reduction of rents, the removal of certain royal ministers, and most of all, recognition. Though the revolt ultimately failed, its leaders killed, its promises retracted, it left a deep mark. It had not come from nothing. It had come from the children of plague survivors, from laborers who had known freedom, however brief, and who could not forget its taste. After the revolt, repression followed. The king promised mercy, but punished leaders. Lords reasserted old rights. New laws tightened travel and labor again. But the old world could not be reassembled. Too many were gone. Too much had changed. The manor system limped on, but hollowed, weakened. Landowners increasingly turned to wage laborers. Peasant holdings grew larger and more secure. By the early 1400s, many families had lived on their lands for 3 or 4 generations with little interference. Some even bought their freedom outright. Serfdom, once the bedrock of medieval England, was eroding. And in its place, a new kind of society was forming. In Bridling Fen, the Toland family endured. Will Toland married a woman from a neighboring village, one whose family had arrived there as laborers during the plague and stayed. Their son, Edward, could read and write. He became the village reeve, not by appointment from a lord, but by election among villagers. He kept records in English, not Latin. He settled disputes, oversaw harvests, and ensured the common pasture remained open to all. What had once been a position of enforcement had become one of stewardship. Even in a small village like Bridling Fen, power had shifted downward. And what of memory? The plague lived on in stories. Old women told of how the birds went silent. Men remember burying entire families in a single day. Children whispered that the West Woods were haunted by ghosts of those unburied. But more than the horror, they remembered what came after. They remembered how, when the Lord stopped arriving, the people had to govern themselves. How they sowed fields without permission. How they argued over wells and fences but found ways to manage. They remembered that, even in death's shadow, they had lived. By the time the 15th century dawned, England was a changed land. Villages were smaller, but stronger. Manners were fewer, but more flexible. Markets were more vibrant. Guilds grew in towns. Education, though still rare, was spreading. And through it all, the children of the plague continued to shape their world, not with rebellion, but with routine. Not with fire, but with furrows. The peasant, once bound to land and law, had become something new, a tenant, a worker, a citizen in embryo. We often think history is made by kings and conquests. But here, in the quiet spaces between, we see another kind of story. A story of resilience. Of people who buried their families, then rose to sow the next season. Of mothers who held their children through fevers and still rose to milk the cow. Of boys who had never seen a church but knew how to read a contract. Of villages like Bridling Fen, once forgotten, now the seedbed of a future that would slowly but surely shift the world. And perhaps the real question is this: if such great change could come not from power, but from survival, what quiet revolutions might be unfolding around us now? unnoticed in their time, but vital to the future. That concludes Story 4, A Plague in the Fields, How Medieval Peasants Survived the Black Death. Story 5, Salt and Silence, The Secret Lives of Medieval Japanese Salt Workers. If you were to walk the ragged coastline of Japan's Noto Peninsula, sometime in the late 13th century, you might miss the most important industry nestled between the waves and the trees. There, among windswept dunes and coastal pines, worked the shioko, salt makers, whose livelihoods depended on an ancient and delicate dance between seawater and sunlight, tide and patience that no feudal castle cast its shadow here. No great battles were fought, but in the clink of ceramic pots, the hiss of seawater on hot iron, and the grit of ash-stained sandals, you would have found a world as vital as any palace, one that sustained the diets, the taxes, and even the religions of medieval Japan. And yet, their story rarely finds its way into textbooks. Let us walk there now. Just before dawn, the village of Ashitsu sat on the western edge of Noto, tucked between forested hills and a long, shallow beach that was unusually flat for Japan's rugged coasts. That flatness, though unremarkable to the eye, made it perfect for ajihama, the traditional salt harvesting method used in this region for centuries. In this method, seawater was manually collected and sprinkled over prepared sand beds. The sun and wind would do their work, drying the sand and leaving it thick with salty crystals. That sand was then shoveled into woven baskets and leached with more seawater in troughs, producing a concentrated brine. This brine was boiled over wood fires in large iron kettles, sometimes for hours, until white salt remained. It was labor-intensive. It was slow, and it was essential. Salt was not merely a flavoring agent in medieval Japan. It was a preservative, one of the few reliable ways to keep food from spoiling in a humid climate. It preserved fish, radishes, plums. It preserved life through long winters. It also preserved power. Taxes were often paid in salt. Temples relied on salt donations to preserve offerings. Samurai needed salt to sustain their rations. And peasants, in turn, needed salt to survive periods of poor harvest. Thus, in the most literal of senses, salt was wealth. And those who controlled its production, whether local lords or distant merchants, wielded more influence than their humble surroundings might suggest. But the workers themselves, the shioko, were not wealthy. They were laborers, often hereditary, passing down their rights to sand and tide through families and guilds. Their hands were scarred by brine and fire. Their lives were ruled by the weather, the moon, and the demands of salt-boiling cauldrons. Uramasa, son of a long line of salt workers in Ashitsu, was such a man. Each morning, he rose before the sun crested over the forests. He dressed in a linen robe bleached pale by years of salt spray, and tied a sash around his waist to hold his tools. He did not pray, not aloud, but he did pause, every day, at the edge of the sea, standing with toes just at the foam line, listening. The waves, he believed, told him what kind of day it would be. Too rough, and the sand beds would flood. Too calm, and the brine would take longer to condense. A good salt day had a breeze and a tide that pulled strong in the morning. And receded by noon. He was not a priest, yet he read omens. Not a farmer, yet he sowed and reaped in salt. The tools of the Eijihama salt worker were humble but specific. There was the yakihama, the sand field prepared for sprinkling seawater. It had to be flat, weed-free, and lined with gravel. Beneath to prevent erosion, there were wooden buckets for collecting seawater, and long-handled ladles to sprinkle it over the sand. Shovels made from cedar were used to turn the sand as it dried. Increasing evaporation. Then came the draining troughs, narrow channels, where wet sand was piled and flushed with fresh seawater to extract brine. The resulting liquid was caught. In ceramic vats. Finally, the boiling done in open-sided huts with fire pits. The iron pans sat atop mud-packed ovens. The brine was ladled in slowly, boiled down carefully, and skimmed constantly. Ash from pine wood added impurities, which had to be strained or skimmed away. It was a craft of rhythm, memory, and patience. The work was seasonal. Spring and summer offered long sunlit hours and steady breezes. These were the busy months when every family in the village, men, women, even children, turned out to the salt fields. In autumn, activity slowed. In winter, the fields lay dormant, and workers turned to other trades, net mending, boat building, or working in the forests. But salt never truly left their minds. It flavored their fish. It whitened their robes. It caked under their fingernails. It paid their debts. And in a quiet way, it defined who they were. There were no grand festivals for salt workers, no elaborate ceremonies. But they did observe certain rites. When the first fire of the season was lit under the boiling kettles, Uramas's wife, Kinu, would place a folded paper charm in the rafters of the salt hut, a simple offering to the sea kami. No grand shrine stood here, but a small stone at the edge of the field bore a moss-covered carving of Ibisu, the patron of fishers and fortune. The charm was not elaborate, nor was the prayer spoken aloud, but it mattered for all the precision of their craft. The Shioko never forgot how fragile it all was, how easily one storm, one poor tide, one illness could undo a season's work. And there were taxes. Salt fields, though humble, were not free from fuel control. The local Jakamachi castle town sent inspectors, often twice a year, to assess production and collect a share of the finished salt. The system was feudal but flexible. Some villages were granted rights to certain beaches by a daimyo in return for steady supply. Others paid merchant guilds for boiling pans or transport. In Noto, the Hatakeyama clan controlled much of the coastal trade, and their officials were a common sight in salt huts. Uramasa remembered, as a child, hiding beneath a table while a tax officer measured their storage jars with a bamboo dipstick. He didn't understand it then, only that it made his mother tense and his father quiet. Now grown, he greeted the officers with formal bows and gave them tea, but never more than that. Despite all this, there was pride. Salt from Noto was renowned for its purity and strength. It traveled far, to Kyoto's markets, to samurai camps, even to temple kitchens where it was used in ritual purification. Sometimes, wrapped in wax cloth and tied with braided cord, a small package of ashitsu salt would be offered at a temple. Altar beside rice and sake. And so, in visible way, Uramas's labor touched not just rice and radish, but prayer and ceremony. His family's name might never be known in courts or chronicles, but the salt they made flavored the very foundations of the nation. Still, their world remained vulnerable. Tides were growing less predictable in recent years. Storms struck harder, more often. Some whispered that distant Mongol attacks had stirred the spirits. Others said it was simply the will of the gods. And with each new hardship, whispers of consolidation reached the coast, that fewer villages might be permitted to harvest salt, that larger operations backed by merchants were replacing family plots. Uramasa didn't know what to make of these rumors. He only knew how to read the tide line, when to light the fire, and how to tell by taste and texture when the salt was ready. That was the world he understood. On a late summer evening, as the sun fell low and orange over the fields, Uramasa stood barefoot in the Yakihama, letting the sand cool beneath his feet. The boiling was done for the day. The fire had been banked. His wife and children were washing buckets in the stream. He bent down, scooped a pinch of fresh salt from a drying pan, and let it fall slowly through his fingers. It shimmered briefly in the fading light, a constellation of white against the dark grain of the cedar pan. There was no music, no applause, just salt dot, just silence, just history unfolding, grain by grain, in a place the world would never think to look. But perhaps the real question is this: if salt was so small, so humble, so easily missed, why did it hold together the lives, the rights, and the survival of a whole nation? Salt was never just a mineral dot by the time Uramasa was 35. The lines on his hands had deepened. The leather strap of his sandal had worn grooves into the top of his foot, and he had learned to hear the kettle song, the quiet, rising hum as brine approached its boiling point. It was a song of fire and water, but also of power. Salt, in medieval Japan, was part of an invisible architecture of control. It was measured and taxed, gifted and stolen, blessed and boiled, and behind every grain was a network of trade and negotiation that reached far beyond the wind-blown beaches of the Noto Peninsula. To understand Uramasa's life, one must follow the salt, where it went, who touched it, and what it meant. Let us begin with the kettle. The kettles used to boil brine into. Salt were not local inventions. The earliest large-scale salt boiling technology arrived in Japan centuries before, likely from the Korean peninsula or southern China, adapted slowly to Japanese shores. The kettles themselves were cast iron, often repurposed from old cookware or merchant scrap, and in some cases imported through regional ports like Hakui and Sado in Ashitsu. The kettles were handed down like heirlooms, patched and repaired with iron rivets and sealed with ash paste. To lose a kettle was to halt production. To crack one mid-season could spell ruin. Uramasa's grandfather, it was said, once carried their family's cracked boiling pan across 3 villages to have it reforged by a blacksmith near Togi, then walked it home balanced on a bamboo pole. That kettle still bore the repair seam, a pale scar across its rounded lip. It was, in a way, a family crest. The fuel used to feed these fires also mattered. The forests near the salt villages were heavily managed. Pine would burn hot and clean, but overharvesting led to erosion, and erosion ruined the salt fields. So the villagers learned to coppice, cutting young trees and allowing new shoots to grow in controlled patterns. Ashes from these pine logs were swept daily and sifted for lye, which sometimes leached into the salt and affected taste. Not all buyers minded. Some believed a hint of ash meant strength. Others wanted purity, whiteness like rice, crystals like snow. And so the salt was grated, coarse for pickling, fine for offerings, yellowed for fish packing, white for tribute. What Uramasa made each day could be destined for a kitchen, a shrine, or a ledger. He never knew. Merchants arrived twice per season, usually from inland towns like Kanazawa or Toyama. They traveled on foot or on horseback, sometimes with porters carrying straw-wrapped ceramic pots slung between them. These pots, known as shirib, were often exchanged on the spot. Salt for goods, rice, cloth, iron tools, or even dried squid. Uramasa preferred trade to coin. Coin could be shaved, cheated, but rice had weight. Cloth could clothe. And besides, salt fetched a better price when needed urgently. Once, after an early autumn storm destroyed part of a fishing village near Wajima, the demand for preserving salt surged. Uramasa and his neighbors filled 3 extra shirib jars that week and traded them for enough rice to last through winter. Disaster elsewhere became survival at home. But there were middlemen. Salt passed from the Shioko to coastal merchants, from coastal merchants to inland traders, and from there to samurai storehouses and temple kitchens. Each step added value and removed the laborer further from recognition. Uramasa knew that the salt he scraped from his kettle might one day season a dish for a court noble in Kyoto, but it would arrive there bearing another man's name, or no name at all. This was not injustice. It was simply the shape of things. Even the tides, after all, obeyed patterns larger than themselves. The taxes, however, were not abstract. Twice each year, the inspector from the Hatakeyama clan would arrive on horseback wearing lacquered wooden sandals and carrying a bamboo scroll case tied with a red cord. His name was Masuda, and he was neither cruel nor friendly. He measured with care. He nodded with silence, and when the measurements failed to meet the clan's quota, whether due to bad weather, broken kettles, or late tides, he recorded it with no anger but no mercy. One season, when a storm ruined half the sandbeds, Matsuda left without comment. Days later, a messenger returned with an order. The shortfall must be repaid in double the next year. No salt, no forgiveness. And so Yoramasa learned that fire did not only burn under kettles, it burned in court halls, in scrolls, in silence. There were stories told among the salt huts that once a family near Suzu failed to meet their tribute and had their boiling pans confiscated, and that the father, unable to reclaim them, wandered the forests until he drowned in a stream. That once, a merchant ship carrying fine Ashitsu salt to the capital was raided by pirates from Sado Island, and the stolen salt was sold as blessed salt from a temple. That once, a child was born in the salt fields during a summer boil, and the midwife wiped his skin with fresh salt to cleanse him of the fire's heat. All true, all false, all told and retold with the same hushed voice beneath the pine rafters as fires thinned. Salt preserved more than food. It preserved memory. Not all was hardship. There were good years. Years when the spring rains came just long enough to cleanse the sand, but not so long as to flood it. Years when the fires burned clean, the brine thickened fast, and merchants arrived early. Years when Yoramasa could give his wife white cloth, or his daughter a comb made of tortoiseshell from traders in Sado. In those years, he allowed himself a sip of sake in the salt hut, just one, poured into a chipped ceramic cup and warmed at the edge of the fire. Not for celebration, exactly. But for endurance. Once, a Buddhist monk passed through Ashitsu. He had walked from the mountains, traveling shrine to shrine, carrying a weather-worn sutra in a bag tied to his back. He asked for salt, not money. Yoramasa gave him a poundful in a twist of paper, and the monk bowed. Salt is the skin of the earth, the monk said. Yoramasa did not understand, but he remembered. He remembered later, during a summer storm that flooded the beds and ruined 3 weeks' work. He remembered as he watched the sea rise and fall. Uncaring. Salt was the skin of the earth, and skin, no matter how thick, could be cut. Even among laborers, salt defined status. Those with more kettles earned more. Those with access to better sandfields, flatter, drier, better drained, held quiet privilege. Some families bribed merchants for better rates. Some, like Yoramasa's, relied only on skill and patience. There was pride in that. Quiet pride, as slow and firm as the setting of brine. But pride did not feed children. And with whispers of reform coming from Kanazawa, talk of centralizing salt production, reducing village-level boiling, encouraging mass shipment from southern ports, that pride felt increasingly brittle. The sea gave, but would it keep giving? That autumn, Yoramasa repaired the roof of his boiling hut with pine branches and ash glue. His son helped him, now 10 years old, tall for his age. He asked about the kettle, whether it would someday be his. Yoramasa looked at the scar line, where his grandfather's repair still held. He said yes, but did not explain the weight of that inheritance. He did not explain that salt might soon be moved by carts instead of shoulders. That large-scale boiling houses in Kaga were rising with tiled roofs and stone ovens. That the shape of salt was changing. He only said, "The kettle sings when it's ready. Learn its song." And the boy nodded, listening. So many things fade in history that we remember the wars, the banners, the emperors, but we forget the kettle's hum. The ash in the sand, the way salt stung when it touched a fresh cut. We forget the small hands that stirred brine with wooden paddles, the smoke that clung to linen robes, the way a mother would wrap salt in cloth and bury it under the floor to keep it safe from damp air dot. And yet, all of it, every boiling fire, every quiet trade, kept a nation's food preserved, its gods appeased, and its people alive. That is the shape of forgotten power. But if so much depended on these humble salt fires, one might ask, what happens when the fire goes out? What happens when the sea no longer shapes the sand? When merchants stop coming? When the kettle cracks? One last time? The final season began as so many others had, with fog over the sea, gulls calling in the early gray, and the faint sulfur scent of ash-laced firewood, smoldering near the boiling hut. But something had changed. Yoramasa noticed it not in a sudden collapse, but in the slow, sifting absence of noise. The footsteps of the merchant were missing. The usual hoarse calls from the road were silent. Even the wind seemed less curious, carrying fewer rumors and less salt-sprayed chatter at first. The village thought it was merely a delay by the third week. They began to understand. It was not that salt had lost its value, but the way it moved. The system it flowed through was evolving. Kaga, the regional power center, had invested in large-scale saltworks, brick ovens, raised flumes. Laborers paid in koku and coin rather than fish and cloth. Ships now carried salt in bulk along the northern sea routes to Nagata and onward. This new salt was cheaper, cleaner, branded with the crest of powerful DAIMYO. It wasn't that Ashitsu's salt was bad. It was simply unnecessary. Yoramasa heard the news one night from an exhausted messenger who'd stopped at the village well to drink. He wore a lacquered crest on his sash, a courier from Nanao. Perhaps they've rerouted the Kaga line, the courier said, rubbing his feet. Salt from the south moves faster, cheaper. No more stops up this way. Yoramasa did not ask for details. He merely bowed, returned to his hut, and sat beside the kettle, now cold. The sea outside hissed gently, as if embarrassed. The next day, he boiled anyway. He gathered brine with his son. They kindled the fire. They stirred and skimmed, just as he always had. The kettle's hum, as the water thickened, was no less beautiful, no less sacred. But there was no merchant to take it, no ledger to record it, no inspector to weigh it. He boiled salt for no one. He boiled because he didn't know what else to do. By season's end, only 5 huts remained active. The others had fallen silent, some torn down for wood, others left to lean awkwardly toward the shore like broken teeth. A few families had already departed inland, taking what tools and cloth they could carry. A woman named Ye, who had once traded salted squid for silks from the south, packed her belongings in straw baskets and walked east. "It's not failure," she said to Yoramasa. "It's just change." But Yoramasa didn't answer to him. It felt like disappearance. His son, however, was curious. "Can we go where the new salt is?" the boy asked. Yoramasa paused. The idea felt treasonous, abandoning their sandbeds, their kettle, their pine rafters. But he looked at the boy's hands, already calloused from carrying brine. He thought of his own father's calloused hands, and his father's before him, and he realized the salt was never the thing. The hands were. And so, at winter's edge, Yoramasa made a choice. He packed the kettle, not the hut, just the iron vessel, wrapped in straw mats and lashed to a handcart. His son helped him tie the rope. They left before dawn, walking inland through the ash-colored forest trails. The kettle between them, each step was quiet. The silence was not sad, exactly. It was full, like the pause between waves. They stopped once at the peak of a low hill and turned back to see the sea. The salt beds were silver in the morning frost, and then they turned away. They reached The edge of Kanazawa after 4 days, walking slowly, sleeping beneath shrines or forest eaves. The city was loud, busy, a nest of tile rooftops and horse carts. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the smell of lacquer, rice, and iron filled the alleys. Uramasa found work not in a salt works. Those were already full, but in a fish pickling shop owned by a retired merchant named Kanatake. "Can you stir?" the man asked. Uramasa nodded. "Can your boy cut?" He nodded again. The man waved them in. The pickling shop was not glamorous. Barrels of daikon and yumaboshi lined the back, their sharp smells filling the air. But there was salt, plenty of it, different in texture and taste from what Uramasa once made. Mined, perhaps, or refined in those southern factories. Still, he stirred it with the same patience, measured with the same hands, taught his son how to pack the pickles in even layers, how to press with stones just heavy enough to draw out moisture. He didn't boil anymore, but he preserved thought that at least he still understood. Years passed. The kettle never boiled again. It sat behind the shop, near the pickle barrels, rusting slowly beneath a bamboo awning. Uramasa kept it out of sentiment, but also out of memory that he could not part with it. Not because it had value, but because it had voice thought in dreams. He still heard its hum. His son, now grown, took over the pickling trade. He modernized the shop, brought in salt from Osaka, hired workers who wore matching aprons and worked by clock. He kept the kettle though, repainted it once, told his own children that it had belonged to a salt master, a title Uramasa had never used for himself. They called him that anyway, the salt master. One summer, long after Uramasa had passed, a traveling scholar came through the shop asking questions about old salt routes. He was compiling a study for the daimyo's court, mapping the history of coastal trade. He saw the kettle and asked about it. The shopkeeper, Uramasa's grandson, pointed at it proudly. That was the last boiling. Pan from Mashitsu. My grandfather carried it here. Does it still work? No, the shopkeeper said, but it sang once. My father told me. And the scholar nodded, scribbled something in a book, and moved on. The village of Ashitsu remained dotted, did not vanish entirely. A few salt huts were converted into fishing sheds. Others collapsed and were reclaimed by dune grass and pine. The beach remained. The tide still kissed the sand. And sometimes, in very dry seasons, old brine channels could still be seen etched faintly across the earth. Tourists, centuries later, would visit the site, a preserved kettle on display beneath glass, labeled with faded characters. Boiling pan, late Muromachi period, recovered from Noto Peninsula. No one stirred it now, but it was there. It had been there. Salt is humble. Grain by grain, it disappears into food. It does not announce itself, but it preserves it preserves fish. It preserves memory. It preserves the labor of men whose names were never recorded. In every bite of pickled plum, every bowl of winter daikon, every offering placed upon a shrine, there is salt. And somewhere in that salt, there is a song, a hum that once rose. From fire and kettle. Soft, forgotten, but real. So, what do we carry forward from a life spent boiling the sea? Not the salt, perhaps, that dissolves, but maybe the hands, the patience, the quiet. Maybe, just maybe, the hum?